The Neverending Story, Chapter 6, The Three Magic Gates. Falkor was still sound asleep when Engiwook brought Atreyu back to the gnome's cave. In the meantime, Urgel had moved the little table into the open and put on all sorts of sweets and fruits and herb jellies. There were also little drinking cups and a pitcher of fragrant herb tea. The table was lit by 2 tiny oil lamps. "Sit down," Urgel commanded. "Atreyu must eat and drink something to give him strength. Medicine alone is not enough." "Thank you," said Atreyu. "I'm feeling fine already." "No back talk," Urgel snapped. "As long as you're here, you'll do as you're told. The poison in your body has been neutralized, so there's no reason to hurry, my boy. You've all the time you need. Just take it easy." "It's not on my account," said Atreyu. "But the childlike empress is dying. Even now, every hour may count." "Rubbish," the old woman grumbled. "Haste makes waste. Sit down, eat, drink." "Better give in," Engiwook whispered. "I know the woman from A to Z. When she wants something, she gets it. Besides, you and I have a lot to talk about." Atreyu squatted cross-legged at the tiny table and fell to. Every bite and every swallow made him feel as if warm, golden life were flowing into his veins. Only then did he notice how weak he had been. Bastian's mouth watered. It seemed to him that he could smell the aroma of the gnome's meal. He sniffed the air, but of course it was only his imagination. His stomach growled audibly. In the end, he couldn't stand it any longer. He took his apple and the rest of his sandwich out of his satchel and ate them both. After that, though far from full, he felt a little better. Then he realized that this was his last meal. The word last terrified him. He tried not to think about it. "Where do you get all those good things?" Atreyu asked Urgel. "Ah, sonny," she said. "It takes a lot of running around to find the right plants, but this knucklehead Engiwook of mine, insists on living here because of his all-important studies. Where the food is to come from is the least of his worries." "Woman," said Engiwook with dignity, "how could you know what's important and what isn't? Be off with you now, and let us talk." Mumbling and grumbling, Urgel withdrew into the little cave, and a moment later Atreyu heard a great clatter of pots and pans. "Don't mind her," said Engiwook under his breath. "She's a good old soul. She just needs something to grumble about now and then. Listen to me, Atreyu. I'm going to let you in on a few things you need to know about the Southern Oracle. It's not easy to get Oyulala. In fact, it's rather difficult, but I don't want to give you a scientific lecture. Maybe it'll be better if you ask questions. I tend to lose myself in details. Just fire away." "All right," said Atreyu. "Who or what is Oyulala?" Engiwook gave him an angry look. "Botheration!" he spluttered. "You're so blunt, so direct, just like my old woman. Couldn't you start with something else?" Atreyu thought a while, then he asked, "That big stone gate with the sphinxes, is that the entrance?" "That's better," said Engiwook. "Now we'll get somewhere. Yes, the gate is the entrance, but then comes 2 more gates, and Oyulala's home is beyond the 3rd, if one can speak of her having a home." "Have you yourself ever been with her?" "Don't be absurd," replied Engiwook, again somewhat nettled. "I'm a scientist. I have collected and collated the statements of all the individuals who have been there, the ones who have come back, that is. Very important work. I can't afford to take personal risks. It could interfere with my work." "I see," said Atreyu. "Now what about these 3 gates?" Engiwook stood up, folded his hands behind his back, and paced. "The first," he lectured, "is known as the Great Riddle Gate. The second is the Magic Mirror Gate. And the third is the No-Key Gate." Strange, Atreyu broke in. As far as I could see, there was nothing behind that stone gate but an empty plain. Where are the other gates?
Be still, Engiwuk scolded. How can I make myself clear if you keep interrupting? It's very complicated. The second gate isn't there until a person has gone through the first, and the third isn't there until the person has the second behind him. And Uyulala isn't there until he has passed through the third. Simply not there. Do you understand?
Atreyu nodded, but preferred to say nothing for fear of irritating the gnome.
Through my telescope you have seen the first, the great riddle gate, and the two sphinxes. That gate is always open. Obviously, there's nothing to close. But even so, no one can get through.
Here, Engiwuk raised a tiny forefinger.
Unless the sphinxes close their eyes. And do you know why? The gaze of a sphinx is different from the gaze of any other creature. You and I, and everyone else, our eyes take something in. We see the world. A sphinx sees nothing. In a sense, she's blind. But her eyes send something out. And what do her eyes send out? All the riddles in the universe. That's why these sphinxes are always looking at each other, because only other sphinxes can stand the sphinx's gaze. So try to imagine what happens to one who ventures into the area where those two gazes meet. He freezes to the spot, unable to move until he has solved all the riddles of the world. If you go there, you'll find the remains of those poor devils.
But, said Atreyu, didn't you say that their eyes sometimes close? Don't they have to sleep now and then?
Sleep? Engiwuk was shaken with giggles. Goodness gracious, a sphinx sleep. I should say not. You really are an innocent. Still, there's some point to your question. All my research, in fact, hinges on that particular point. The sphinxes shut their eyes for some travelers and led them through. The question that no one has answered up until now is this. Why one traveler and not another? Because you mustn't suppose they let wise, brave, or good people through and keep the stupid, cowardly, and wicked out. Not a bit of it. With my own eyes, I've seen them admit stupid fools and treacherous knaves, while decent, sensible people have been given up after kept waiting for months. And it seems to make no difference whether a person has some serious reason for consulting the oracle, or whether it's just come from the fun of it.
Haven't your investigation suggested some explanation? Atreyu asked.
Angry flashes darted from Engiwuk's eyes. Have you been listening, or haven't you? Didn't I just say that so far no one has answered that question? Of course I've worked up a few theories over the years. At first I thought the Sphinx's judgment might be guided by certain physical characteristics. Size, beauty, strength, and so on. But I soon had to stop the idea. Then I toyed with numerical patterns. The idea, for instance, that 3 out of 5 were regularly excluded, or that only prime-numbered candidates were admitted. That worked pretty well for the past, but for forecasting it was no use at all. Since then, I've come to the conclusion that the Sphinx's decision is based on pure chance and that no principle whatsoever is involved. But my wife calls my conclusions scandalous, unfantastican, and absolutely unscientific. Are you starting your old nonsense again? Came Urgel's angry voice from the cave. Shame on you! Such skepticism only shows that the bit of brain you once had has dried up on you. Hear that? Said Engiwuk with a sigh. And the worst of it is, she's right.
What about the childlike Empress's amulet? Atreyu asked. Do you think they'll respect it? They too are natives of Fantastica, after all.
Yes, I suppose they are, said Engiwuk, shaking his apple-sized head. But to respect it, they'd have to see it, and they don't see anything. But their gaze would strike you, and I'm not sure the Sphinxes would obey the childlike Empress. Maybe they're greater than she is. I don't know. Anyway, it's most worrisome.
Then what do you advise? Atreyu asked.
You will have to do what all the others have done. Wait and see what the Sphinxes decide, without hoping to know why.
Atreyu nodded thoughtfully. Urgel came out of the cave. In one hand, she held a bucket with some steaming liquid in it, and under her other arm she was carrying a bundle of dried plants. Muttering to herself, she went to the luck dragon, who was still laying motionless, fast asleep. She started climbing around on him and changing the dressing on his wounds. Her enormous patient heaved one contented sigh and stretched. Otherwise, he seemed unaware of her ministrations. "Couldn't you make yourself a little useful?" she said to Engiwuk as she was hurrying back to the kitchen. "Instead of sitting around like this, talking rubbish." "I am making myself extremely useful," her husband called after her. "Possibly more useful than you, but that's more than a simple-minded woman like you will ever understand." Turning to Atreyu, he went on. "She can only think of practical matters. She has no feeling for the great overarching ideas." The clock in the belfry struck 3. By now, Bastian's father must have noticed, if he was ever going to, that Bastian hadn't come home. Would he worry? Maybe he'd go looking for him. Maybe he had already notified the police. Maybe calls had gone out over the radio. Bastian felt a sick pain in the pit of his stomach. But if the police had been notified, where would they look for him? Could they possibly come to this attic? Had he locked the door when he came back from the toilet? He couldn't remember. He got up and checked. Yes, the door was locked and bolted. Outside, the November afternoon was drawing to a close. Ever so slowly, the light was falling. To steady his nerves, Bastian paced the floor for a while. Looking about him, he discovered quite a few things one wouldn't have expected to find in a school. For instance, a battered old Victrola with a big horn attached. God only knew when and by whom it had been brought here. In one corner, there were some paintings in ornate gilt frames. They were so faded that hardly anything could be made out. Only here and there a pale, solemn-looking face that shimmered against a dark background. And then there was a rusty, 7-armed candelabrum, still holding the stumps of thick wax candles, bearded with drippings. Bastian gave a sudden start, for looking into a dark corner, he saw someone moving. But when he looked again, it dawned on him that he had only seen himself reflected in a large mirror that had lost half its silvering. He went closer and looked at himself for a while. He was really nothing much to look at, with his pudgy build and his bow legs and pasty face. He shook his head and said aloud, "No!" Then he went back to his mats. By then it was so dark that he had to hold the book up to his eyes. "Where were we?" Engiwuk asked. "At the great riddle gate," Atreyu reminded him. "Right. Now suppose you've managed to get through. Then, and only then, the second gate will be there for you. The magic mirror gate, as I've said. I myself have not been able to observe it. What I tell you has been gleaned from travelers' account. This second gate is both open and closed. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? It might be better to say neither closed nor open, though that doesn't make it any less crazy. The point is that this gate seems to be a big mirror, or something of the kind, though it's made of neither glass nor of metal. What it is made of, no one has been able to tell. Anyway, when you stand before it, you see yourself, but not as you would in an ordinary mirror. You don't see your outward appearance. What you see is your real innermost nature. If you want to go true, you have to, in a manner of speaking, go into yourself." "Well," said Atreyu, "it seems to me that this magic mirror gate is easier to get through than the first." "Wrong!" cried Engiwuk. Once again, he began to trot back and forth in agitation. "Dead wrong, my friend. I've known travelers who've considered themselves absolutely blameless to yelp with horror and run away at the sight of the monster grinning out of the mirror at them. We had to care for some of them for weeks before they were even
able to start home. We? Growled Urgle, who was passing with another bucket. I keep hearing we. When did you ever take care of anybody? Engiwuk waved her away. Others, he went on lecturing, appear to have seen something even more horrible, but had the courage to go through. What some saw was not so frightening, but it still cost every one of them an inner struggle. Nothing, I can say, would apply to all. It's a different experience each time. Good, said Atreyu. Then at least it's possible to go through this magic mirror gate. Oh yes, of course it's possible, or it wouldn't be a gate. Where's your logic, my boy? But it's also possible to go around it, said Atreyu. Or isn't it? Yes, indeed, said Engiwuk. Of course it is. But if you do that, there's nothing more behind it. The third gate isn't there until you've gone through the second. How often do I have to tell you that? I understand. But what about this third gate? That's where things get really difficult, because you see, the no-key gate is closed. Simply closed. And that's that. There's no handle, and no doorknob, and no keyhole. Nothing. My theory is that this single, hermetically closed door is made of fantastic and selenium. You may know that there's no way of destroying, bending, or dissolving fantastic and selenium. It's absolutely indestructible. Then there's no way of getting through. Not so fast, my boy. Certain individuals have got through and spoken with Uyulala, so the door can be opened. But how? Just listen. Fantastic and selenium reacts to our will. It's our will that makes things unyielding. But if someone succeeds in forgetting all purpose, in wanting nothing at all, to him the gate will open of its own accord. Atreyu looked down and said in an undertone, If that's the case, how can I possibly get through? How can I manage not to want to get through? Engiwuk sighed, nodded and sighed. Just what I've been saying. The no-key gate is the hardest. But if I succeed after all, Atreyu asked, will I then be in the Southern Oracle? Yes, said the gnome. But who or what is Uyulala? No idea, said the gnome, and his eyes sparkled with fury. None of those who have reached her has been willing to tell me. How can I expect to complete my scientific work if everyone cloaks himself in mysterious silences? I could tear my hair out if I had any left. If you reach her, Atreyu, will you tell me? Will you? One of these days my thirst for knowledge will be the death of me, and no one is willing to help. I beg you, promise you'll tell me. Atreyu stood up and looked at the great riddle gate, which lay bathed in moonlight. I can't promise that, Engiwuk, he said softly, though I'd be glad to show my gratitude. But if no one has told you who or what Uyulala is, there must be a reason. And before I know what that reason is, I can't decide whether someone who hasn't seen her with his own eyes has a right to know. In that case, get away from me, screamed the gnome, his eyes literally spewing sparks. All I get is ingratitude. All my life I wear myself out trying to reveal a secret of universal interest, and no one helps me. I should never have bothered with you. With that, he ran into the little cave, and a door could be heard slamming within. Urgle passed Atreyu and said with a titter, The old fool means no harm, but he's always running into such disappointments with this ridiculous investigation of his. He wants to go down in history as the one who has solved the great riddle, the world-famous gnome Engiwuk. You mustn't mind him. Of course not, said Atreyu. Just tell him I thank him with all of my heart for what he has done for me. And I thank you too. If it's allowed, I will tell him the secret if I come back. Then you're leaving us? Urgle asked. I have to, said Atreyu. There's no time to be lost. Now I shall go to the oracle. Farewell. And in the meantime, take good care of Falkor, the luck dragon. With that, he turned away and strode towards the great riddle gate.
Urgle watched the erect figure with the blowing cloak vanish among the rocks and ran after him, crying, "Lots of luck, Atreyu!" But she didn't know whether he had heard or not. As she waddled back to her little cave, she muttered to herself, "You'll need it, all right. You'll need lots of luck." Atreyu was now within 50 feet of the great stone gate. It was much larger than he had judged from a distance. Behind it lay a deserted plain. There was nothing to stop the eye, and Atreyu's gaze seemed to plunge into an abyss of emptiness. In front of the gate, and between the two pillars, Atreyu saw only innumerable skulls and skeletons, all that was left of the varied species of fantasticans who had tried to pass through the gate, but had been frozen forever by the gaze of the sphinxes. But it wasn't those gruesome reminders that stopped Atreyu. What stopped him was the sight of the sphinxes. He had been through a good deal in the course of the great quest. He had seen beautiful things and horrible things, but up until now he had not known that one and the same creature can be both, that beauty can be terrifying. The two monsters were bathed in moonlight, and as Atreyu approached them, they seemed to grow beyond measure. Their heads seemed to touch the moon, and their expression as they looked at each other seemed to change with every step he took. Currents of a terrible, unknown force flashed through the upraised bodies, and still more through the almost human faces. It was as though these beings did not merely exist in the way marble, for instance, exists, but as if they were on the verge of vanishing, but would recreate themselves at the same time. For that very reason, they seemed far more real than anything made of stone. Fear gripped Atreyu. Fear not so much of the danger that threatened him as of something above and beyond his own self. It hardly grazed his mind that if the Sphinx's gaze should strike him, he would freeze to the spot forever. No. What made his steps heavier and heavier until he felt as though he were made of cold grey lead was fear of the unfathomable, of something intolerably vast. Yet he went on. He stopped looking up. He kept his head bowed and walked very slowly, foot by foot, towards the stone gate. Heavier and heavier grew his burden of fear. He thought it would crush him, but still he went on. He didn't know whether the sphinxes had closed their eyes or not. Would he be admitted, or would this be the end of his great quest? He had no time to lose in worrying. He just had to take his chances. At a certain point, he felt sure that he had not enough willpower left to carry him a single step forward. And just then he heard the echo of his footfalls within the great vaulted gate. Instantly, every last shred of fear fell from him, and he knew that whatever might happen, he would never again be afraid. Looking up, he saw that the great riddle gate lay behind him. The sphinxes had led him through. Up ahead, no more than 20 paces away, where previously there had been nothing but the grey empty plain, he saw the magic mirror gate. This gate was large and round like a second moon, for the real moon was still shining high in the sky, and it glittered like polished silver. It was hard to imagine how anyone could pass through a metal surface, but Atreyu didn't hesitate for a moment. After what Engiwook had said, he expected a terrifying image of himself to come towards him, out of the mirror, but now that he had left all fear behind him, he hardly gave the matter a thought. What he saw was something quite unexpected, which wasn't the least bit terrifying, but which baffled him completely. He saw a fat little boy with a pale face, a boy his own age, and this little boy was sitting on a pile of mats, reading a book. The little boy had large, sad-looking eyes, and he was wrapped in frayed grey blankets. Behind him, a few motionless animals could be distinguished in the half-light. An eagle, an owl, and a fox. And farther off there was something that looked like a white skeleton. He couldn't make out exactly what it was. Bastian gave a start when he realized what he had just read. Why, that was him! The description was right in every detail. The book trembled in his hands. This was going too far. How could there be something in a book that applied only to this particular moment and only to him? It could only be a crazy accident, but a very remarkable accident. Bastian, he said aloud, you really are a screwball. Pull yourself together. He had meant to say this very sternly, but his voice quavered a little, for he was not quite sure that what had happened was an accident. Just imagine, he thought. What if they've really heard of me in Fantastica? Wouldn't that be wonderful? But he didn't dare say it aloud. A faint smile of astonishment played over Atreyu's lips as he passed into the mirror image. He was rather surprised that he was succeeding so easily in something that others had found insuperably difficult. But on the way through he felt a strange, prickly shudder. He had no suspicion of what had really happened to him. For when he emerged on the far side of the magic mirror, he had lost all memory of himself, of his past life, aims and purposes. He had forgotten the great quest that had brought him there, and he didn't even know his own name. He was like a newborn child. Up ahead of him, only a few steps away, he saw the no-key gate, but he had forgotten its name and forgotten that his purpose in passing through it was to reach the southern oracle. He had no idea why he was there or what he was supposed to do. He felt light and cheerful, and he laughed for no reason, for the sheer pleasure of it. The gate he saw before him was as small and low as a common door and stood all by itself, with no walls around it, on the empty plain. And this door was closed. Atreyu looked at it for a while. It seemed to be made of some material with a coppery sheen. It was nice to look at, but Atreyu soon lost interest. He went around the gate and examined it from behind, but the back looked no different than the front, and there was neither handle nor knob nor keyhole. Obviously this door could not be opened, and anyway, why would anyone want to open it since it led nowhere and was just standing there? For behind the gate there was only the wide, flat, empty plain. Atreyu felt like leaving. He turned back, went around the magic mirror gate, and looked at it for some time without realizing what it was. He decided to go away. No, don't go away, said Bastian aloud. Turn around. You have to go through the no-key gate. But then turned back to the no-key gate. He wanted to look at its coppery sheen again. Once more he stood in front of the gate, bending his head to the left, bending it to the right, enjoying himself. Tenderly he stroked the strange material. It felt warm and almost alive, and the door opened by a crack. Atreyu stuck his head through, and then he saw something he hadn't seen on the other side when he had walked around the gate. He pulled his head back, looked past the gate, and saw only the empty plain. He looked again through the crack in the door and saw a long corridor formed by innumerable huge columns. And farther off there were stairs and more pillars and terraces and more stairs and a whole forest of columns. But none of these columns supported a roof, for above them Atreyu could see the night sky. He passed through the gate and looked around him with wonderment. The door closed behind him. The clock in the belfry struck 4. Little by little, the murky light was failing. It was getting too dark to read by. Bastian put the book down. What was he to do now? There was bound to be electric light in this attic. He groped his way to the door and ran his hand along the wall, but he couldn't find a switch. He looked on the opposite side, and again there was none. He took a bucket of matches from his trouser pocket. He always had matches on him, for he had a weakness for making little fires. But they were damp, and the first 3 wouldn't light. In the faint glow of the fort, he tried to locate a light switch, but there wasn't any. The thought of having to spend the whole evening and night here in total darkness gave him the cold shivers. He was no baby, and at home or in any other familiar place he had no fear of the dark, but this enormous attic with all the weird things in it was something else again. The match burned his fingers, and he threw it away. For a while he just stood there and listened. The rain had let up, and now he could barely hear the drumming on the big tin roof. Then he remembered the rusty 7-armed candelabrum he had seen. He groped his way across the room, found the candelabrum, and dragged it to his pile of mats. He lit the wicks in the thick stubs, all 7, and a golden light spread. The flames crackled faintly and wavered now and then in the draught. With a sigh of relief, Bastian picked up the book. Chapter 7, The Voice of Silence. Gladness buoyed Atreyu's heart as he strode into the forest of columns, which cast black shadows in the bright moonlight. In the deep silence that surrounded him, he barely heard his own footfalls. He no longer knew who he was or what his name was, how he had got there, or what he was looking for. He was full of wonder, but quite undismayed. The floor was made of mosaic tiles, showing strange ornamental designs or mysterious scenes and images. Atreyu passed over it, climbing broad steps, came to a vast terrace, descended another set of steps, and passed down a long avenue of stone columns. He examined them, one after another, and it gave him pleasure to see that each was decorated with different signs and symbols. Farther and farther he went from the no-key gate. At last, when he had gone heaven knows how far, he heard a hovering sound in the distance and stopped to listen. The sound came closer. It was a singing voice, but it seemed very, very sad, almost like a sob at times. This lament passed over the columns like a breeze, then stopped in one place, rose and fell, came and went, and seemed to move in a wide circle around Atreyu. He stood still and waited. Little by little, the circle became smaller, and after a while he was able to understand the words the voice was singing. "Oh, nothing can happen more than once, but all things must happen one day. Over hill and dale, over wood and stream, my dying voice will blow away." Atreyu turned in the direction of the voice, which darted fitfully among the columns, but he could see no one. "Who are you?" he cried. The voice came back to him like an echo. "Who are you?" Atreyu pondered. "Who am I?" he murmured. "I don't know. I have a feeling that I once knew, but does it matter?" The singing voice answered. "If questions you would ask of me, you must speak in poetry. For rhymeless talk that strikes my ear, I cannot hear, I cannot hear." Atreyu hadn't much practice in rhyming. This would be a difficult conversation, he thought, if the voice only understood poetry. He racked his brains for a while, then he came out with, "I hope it isn't going too far, but could you tell me who you are?" This time the voice answered at once. "I hear you now, your words are clear, I understand as well as hear." And then, coming from a different direction, it sang, "I thank you, friend, for your goodwill. I'm glad that you have come to me. I'm Huyulala, the voice of silence, in the palace of deep mystery." Atreyu noticed that the voice rose and fell, but was never wholly silent. Even when it sang no words, or when it was speaking, A sound hovered in the air. For a time it seemed to stand still, then it moved slowly away from him. He ran after it and asked, "Oh, Uyulala, tell me where you're hid. I cannot see you, and so wish I did." Passing him by, the voice breathed in his ear. "Never has anyone seen me, never do I appear. You will never see me, and yet I am here." "Then you're invisible?" he asked. But when no answer came, he remembered that he had to speak in rhyme and asked, "Have you no body? Is that what you mean? Or is it only that you can't be seen?" He heard a soft, bell-like sound, which might have been a laugh or a sob, and the voice sang, "Yes and no, and neither one. I do not appear in the brightness of the sun, as you appear, for my body is but sound, that one can hear but never see, and this voice you're hearing now is all there is of me." In amazement, Atreyu followed the sound this way and that way through the forest of columns. It took him some time to get a new question ready. "Do I understand you right? Your body is this melody? But what if you should cease to sing? Would you cease to be?" The answer came to him from very near. "Once my song is ended, what comes to others soon or late, when their bodies pass away, will also be my fate. My life will last the time of my song, but that will not be long." Now it seemed certain that the voice was sobbing, and Atreyu, who could not understand why, hastened to ask, "Why are you so sad? Why are you crying? You sound so young. Why speak of dying?" And the voice came back, like an echo. "I am only a song of lament. The wind will blow me away. But tell me now why you were sent. What have you come to say?" The voice died away among the columns, and Atreyu turned in all directions, trying to pick it up again. For a while he heard nothing. Then, starting in the distance, the voice came quickly closer. It sounded almost impatient. "Uyulala's answers on questions feed. So ask me what you've come to ask, for questions are her need." Atreyu cried out, "Then help me, Uyulala. Tell me why you sing a plaint as if you soon must die." And the voice sang, "The childlike empress is sick, and with her Fantastica will die. The nothing will swallow this place, it will perish, and so will I. We shall vanish into the nowhere and never, as though we had never been. The empress needs a new name to make her well again." Atreyu pleaded, "Oh, tell me, Uyulala, oh, tell me who can give the childlike empress the name which alone will let her live." The voice replied, "Listen and listen well to the truth I have to tell. Though your spirits may be blind to the sense of what I say, print my words upon your mind before you go away. Later you may dredge them up from the depths of memory, raise them to the light of day exactly as they flow from me. Everything depends on whether you remember faithfully." For a time he heard only a plaintive sound without words. Then suddenly the voice came from right next to him, as though someone were whispering into his ear. "Who can give the childlike empress the new name that will make her well? Not you, not I, no elf, no djinn can save us from the evil spell, for we are figures in a book. We do what we were invented for, but we can fashion nothing new, and cannot change from what we are. But there's a realm outside Fantastica. The outer world is its name. The people who live there are rich indeed, and not at all the same. Born of the word, the children of men, or humans as they're sometimes called. I have had the gift of giving names ever since our worlds began. In every age, it's they who gave the childlike empress life, for wondrous new names have the power to save. But now, for many and many a day, no human has visited Fantastica.
for they no longer know the way. They have forgotten how real we are. They don't believe in us anymore. Oh, if only one child of man would come. Oh, then at last the thing would be done. If only one would hear our plea. For them it's near, but for us too far. Never can we go out to them, for theirs is the world of reality. But tell me, my hero, you so young, will you remember what I have sung? Oh yes, cried Atreyu in his bewilderment. He was determined to imprint every word on his memory, though he had forgotten what for. He merely had a feeling that it was very, very important. But the sing-song voice and the efforts of hearing and speaking in rhymes made him sleepy. He murmured, I will remember every word. But tell me, what shall I do with what I've heard? And the voice answered, That is for you alone to decide. I've told you what was in my heart. So this is when our ways divide, when you and I must part. Almost half asleep, Atreyu asked, But if you go away, where will you stay? Again he heard the sobbing in the voice, which receded more and more as it sang. The nothing has come near, the oracle is dying. No one again will hear Uyulala laughing, singing. You are the last to hear my voice among the columns, sounding far and near. Perhaps you will accomplish what no one else has done. But to succeed, young hero, remember what I have sung. And then, farther and farther in the distance, Atreyu heard the words, Oh, nothing can happen more than once, but all things must happen one day. Over hill and dale, over wood and stream, my dying voice will blow away. That was the last Atreyu heard. He sat down, propped his back against the column, looked up at the night sky, and tried to understand what he had heard. Silence settled around him like a soft, warm cloak, and he fell asleep. When he awoke in the cold dawn, he was lying on his back, looking up at the sky. The last stars paled. Uyulela's voice still sounded in his thoughts, and then suddenly he remembered everything that had gone before and the purpose of his great quest. At last he knew what was to be done. Only a human, a child of man, someone from the world beyond the borders of Fantastica could give the childlike empress a new name. He would just have to find a human and bring him to her. Briskly he sat up. Ah, thought Bastian, how gladly I would help her. Her and Atreyu too. What a beautiful name I would think up. If I only knew how to reach Atreyu, I'd go this minute. Wouldn't he be amazed if I were suddenly standing before him? But it's impossible. Or is it? And then he said under his breath, If there's any way of my getting to you in Fantastica, tell me, Atreyu. I'll come without fail. You'll see. When Atreyu looked around, he saw that the forest of columns with its stairways and terraces had vanished. Whichever way he looked, there was only the empty plain that he had seen behind each of the 3 gates before going through. But now the gates were gone, all 3 of them. He stood up and again looked in all directions. It was then that he discovered in the middle of the plain a patch of nothing like those he had seen in Howling Forest, but this time it was much nearer. He turned around and ran the other way as fast as he could. He had been running for some time when he saw far in the distance a rise in the ground and thought it might be the stony rust-red mountains where the great riddle gate was. He started toward it, but he had a long way to go before he was close enough to make out any details. Then he began to have doubts. The landscape looked about right, but there was no gate to be seen, and the stones were not red, but dull grey. Then, when he had gone much farther, he saw 2 great stone pillars with a space between them. The lower part of a gate, he thought, but there was no arch above it. What had happened? Hours later, he reached the spot and discovered the answer. The great stone arch had collapsed, and the sphinxes were gone.
Atreyu threaded his way through the ruins, then climbed to the top of a stone pyramid and looked out, trying to locate the place where he had left the gnomics and the luck dragon. Or had they fled from the nothing in the meantime? At last he saw a tiny flag moving this way and that behind the balustrade of Engiwuk's observatory. Atreyu waved both arms, cupped his hand around his mouth, and shouted, "Ho! Are you still up there?" The sound of his voice had hardly died away when a pearly white luck dragon rose from the hollow where the gnomes had their cave and flew through the air with lazy, sinuous movements. He must have been feeling playful, for now and then he turned over on his back and looped the loop so fast that he looked like a burst of white flame. And then he landed, not far from the pyramid where Atreyu was standing. When he propped himself on his forepaws, he was so high above Atreyu that to bring his head close to him, he had to bend his long, supple neck sharply downward. Rolling his ruby-red eyeballs for joy, stretching his tongue far out of his wide-open gullet, he boomed in his bronze bell voice, "Atreyu, my friend and master, so you finally come back. I'm so glad. We had almost given up hope. The gnomes, that is, not I." "I'm glad too," said Atreyu. "But what has happened in this one night?" "One night?" cried Falkor. "Do you think it's been only one night? You're in for a surprise. Climb on, I'll carry you." Atreyu swung himself up on the enormous animal's back. It was his first time aboard a luck dragon, and though he had ridden wild horses and was anything but timid, this first short ride through the air took his breath away. He clung fast to Falkor's flowing mane, and Falkor called back with a resounding laugh, "You'll just have to get used to it." "At least," Atreyu called back, gasping for air, "you seem to be well again." "Pretty near," said the dragon. "Not quite." Then they landed outside the gnome's cave, and there in the entrance were Engiwuk and Urgle waiting for them. Engiwuk's tongue went right to work. "What have you seen and done? Tell us all about it. Those gates, for instance. Do they bear out my theories? And who or what is Uyulala?" But Urgle cut him off. "That'll do. Let the boy eat and drink. What do you think I've cooked and baked for? Plenty of time later for your idle curiosity." Atreyu climbed down off the dragon's back and exchanged greetings with the gnomes. Again, the little table was set with all sorts of delicacies and a steaming pot of herb tea. The clock in the belfry struck 5. Bastian thought sadly of the 2 chocolate nut bars that he kept at his bedside table at home in case he should be hungry at night. If he had suspected that he would never go back there, he could have brought them along as an iron ration, but it was too late to think of that now. Falkor stretched out in the little gully in such a way that his huge head was near Atreyu, and he could hear everything. "Just imagine," he said, "my friend and master thinks he was gone for only one night." "Was it longer?" Atreyu asked. 7 days and 7 nights, said Falkor. "Look, my wounds are almost healed." Then for the first time, Atreyu noticed that his own wound too was healed. The herb dressing had fallen off. He was amazed. "How can it be? I passed through 3 magic gates, I talked with Uyulala, then I fell asleep. But I can't possibly have slept that long." "Space and time," said Engiwuk, "must be different in there. Anyway, no one has ever stayed in the Oracle as long as you. What happened? Are you finally going to speak?" "First," said Atreyu, "I'd like to know what has happened here." "You can see for yourself," said Engiwuk. "The colors are all fading. Everything is getting more and more unreal. The great riddle gate isn't there anymore. It looks as if the nothing were taking over." "What about the sphinxes? Where have they gone? Did they fly away? Did you see them go?" "We saw nothing," Engiwuk lamented. "We hoped you could tell us something. Suddenly the stone gate was in ruins, but none of us saw or heard a thing. I even went over and examined the wreckage. And do you know what I found?" The fragments are as old as the hills and overgrown with grey moss, as if they had been lying there for hundreds of years, as if the great riddle gate had never existed. It was there, though, said Atreyu under his breath, because I went through it, and then I went through the magic mirror gate and the no-key gate. And then Atreyu reported everything that had happened to him. Now he remembered every last detail. As Atreyu told them his story, Engiwuk, who at first had impatiently demanded further information, became more and more subdued. And when Atreyu repeated almost word for word what Uyulala had told him, the gnome said nothing at all. His shriveled little face had taken on a look of deepest gloom. "Well," said Atreyu in conclusion, "now you know the secret. Uyulala is just a voice. She can only be heard. She is where she sings." For a time, Engiwuk was silent. When he spoke, his voice was husky. "You mean she was?" "Yes," said Atreyu. "She herself said no one else would ever hear her speak. I was the last." 2 little tears flowed down Engiwuk's wrinkled cheeks. "All for nothing," he croaked. "My whole life work, all my research, my year-long observations. At last someone brings me the last stone for my scientific edifice. Finally, I'm in a position to complete my work, to write the last chapter. And it's absolutely futile and superfluous. It's no longer of the slightest interest to anyone because the object under investigation has ceased to exist. There goes my hopes, all shattered." He seemed to break into a fit of coughing, but actually he was shaken with sobs. Moved to sympathy, Urgold stroked his bald little head and mumbled, "Poor old Engiwuk, poor old Engiwuk. Don't let it get you down. You'll find something else to occupy you." "Woman!" Engiwuk fumed at her. "What you see before you is not a poor old Engiwuk, but a tragic figure." Once again he ran into the cave, and again a door was heard slamming within. Urgel shook her head and sighed. "He means no harms," she muttered. "He's a good old sort, if only he weren't plump crazy." When they finished eating, Urgel stood up and said, "I've got to pack now. We can't take much with us, but we will need a few things. I'd better hurry." "You're going away?" Atreyu asked. Urgel nodded. "We have no choice," she said sadly. "Where the nothing takes hold, nothing grows. And now my poor old man has no reason to stay. We'll just have to see how we make out. We'll find a place somewhere. But what about you? What are your plans?" "I have to do as Uyulala told me," said Atreyu. "Try and find a human and take him to the childlike empress to give her a new name." "Where will you look for this human?" Urgel asked. "I don't know," said Atreyu. "Somewhere beyond the borders of Fantastica." "We'll get there," came Falcor's bell-like voice. "I'll carry you. You'll see, we'll be lucky." "In that case," Urgel grunted, "you'd better get started." "Maybe we could give you a lift," Atreyu suggested, "for part of the way." "That's all I need," said Urgel. "You won't catch me gallivanting around in the air. A self-respecting gnome keeps his feet on the ground. Besides, you mustn't let us delay you. You have more important things to do, for us all." "But I want to show my gratitude," said Atreyu. "The best way of doing that is to get started and stop frittering the time away with useless jibber-jabber." "She's got something there," said Falcor. "Let's go, Atreyu." Atreyu swung himself up on the luck dragon's back. One last time he turned back and shouted, "Goodbye!" But Urgel was already inside the cave, packing. When some hours later she and Engiwuk stepped out into the open, each was carrying an overloaded back basket, and again they were busily quarreling. Off they waddled on their tiny crooked legs and never once looked back. Later on, Engiwuk became very famous. In fact, he became the most famous gnome in the world, but not because of his scientific investigations. That, however, is another story, and shall be told another time. At the moment when the two gnomes were starting out, Atreyu was far away, whizzing through the skies of Fantastica on the back of Falkor, the white luck dragon. Involuntarily, Bastian looked up at the skylight, trying to imagine how it would be if Falkor came cutting through the darkened sky like a dancing white flame, if he and Atreyu were coming to get him. Oh my, he sighed. Wouldn't that be something? He could help them, and they could help him. He would be saved, and so would Fantastica. That was chapter 7. Thank you, Buffy. That was great. Your timing was perfect. Chapter 8. The Wind Giants. High in the air rode Atreyu, his red cloak flowing behind him. His blue-black hair fluttered in the wind. With steady, wave-like movements, Falkor, the white luck dragon, glided through the mists and tatters of clouds. Up and down, and up and down, and up and down. How long had they been flying? For days and nights and more days, Atreyu had lost track. The dragon had the gift of flying in his sleep. Farther and farther they flew. Sometimes Atreyu dozed off, clinging fast to the dragon's white mane, but it was only a light, restless sleep, and more his waking became a dream, all hazy and blurred. Shadowy mountains passed below him, lands and seas, islands and rivers. Atreyu had lost interest in them, gave up trying to hurry Falkor as he had done on first leaving the Southern Oracle. For then he had been impatient, thinking it a simple matter for one with a dragon to ride to reach the border of Fantastica and cross it to the outer world. He hadn't known how very large Fantastica was. Now he had to fight the leaden weariness he was trying to overpower him. His eyes, once as keen as a young eagle's, had lost their distant vision. From time to time he would pull himself upright and try to look around, but then he would sink back and stare straight ahead at the dragon's long, supple body. With its pearly pink and white scales, Falkor was tired too. His strength, which had seemed inexhaustible, was running out. More than once, in the course of their long flight, they had seen below them spots which the nothing had invaded, and which gave them the feeling that they were going blind. Seen from that height, many of these spots seemed relatively small, but others were as big as whole countries. Fear gripped the luck dragon and his rider, and at first they changed direction to avoid looking at the horror. But strange as it may seem, horror loses its power to frighten when repeated too often. And since the patches of nothing became more and more frequent, the travelers were gradually getting used to them. They had been flying in silence for quite some time when suddenly Falkor's bronze-belled tongue rang out. "Atreyu, my little master, are you asleep?" "No," said Atreyu, though actually he had been caught up in a terrifying dream. "What is it, Falkor?" "I've been wondering if it wouldn't be wiser to turn back." "Turn back? Where to?" "To the ivory tower, to the childlike empress." "You want us to go to her empty-handed?" "I wouldn't call it that, Atreyu. What was your mission?" "To discover the cause of her illness and find out what would cure it." "But," said Falkor, "nothing was said about you bringing her the cure." "What do you mean?" "Maybe it's a mistake, trying to cross the border of Fantastica in search of a human." "I don't see what you're driving at, Falkor. Explain yourself." "The childlike empress is deathly sick," said the dragon, "because she needs a new name. Morla, the aged one, told you that, but only a human, only a child of men from the outer world can give her its name. Uyulala told you that.
So you've actually completed your mission. It seemed to me you should let the childlike Empress know it as soon as possible.
But it won't do her any bit of good, Atreyu protested, unless I bring her the human who can save her.
Don't be so sure, said Falkor. She has much greater power than you or I. Maybe she would have no difficulty in bringing a human to Fantastica. Maybe she has ways that are unknown to you and me and everyone else in Fantastica. But to do so, she needs to know what you have found out. If that's the way it is, there's no point in our trying to find a human on our own. She might even die while we're looking. But maybe if we turn back in time, we can save her.
Atreyu made no answer. The dragon could be right, he reflected. But then he could be wrong. If he went back now with his message, the childlike Empress might very well say, "What good does that do to me? And now it's too late to send you out again." He didn't know what to do, and he was tired, much too tired to decide anything. "You know, Falkor," he said, hardly above a whisper, "you may be right, or you may be wrong. Let's fly on a little further. Then if we haven't come to a border, we'll turn back."
"What do you mean by a little further?" the dragon asked.
"A few hours," Atreyu murmured. "Or maybe just 1 hour."
"All right," said Falkor. "Just 1 hour."
But that 1 hour was 1 hour too many. They hadn't noticed that the sky in the north was black with clouds. In the west, the sky was aflame, and ugly-looking clouds hung down over the horizon like seaweed. In the east, a storm was rising like a blanket of grey lead, and all around it there were tatters of cloud that looked like blue ink blots. And from the south came a sulphur-yellow mist, streaked with lightning.
"We seem to be getting into bad weather," said Falkor.
Atreyu looked in all directions. "Yeah," he said, "it looks bad. But what can we do but fly on?"
"It would be more sensible," said Falkor, "to look for shelter. If this is what I think it is, it's no joke."
"What do you think?" Atreyu asked.
"I think it's the 4 wind giants starting one of their battles. They're almost always fighting to see which is the strongest and should rule over the others. To them it's a sort of game, because they have nothing to fear, but God help anyone who gets caught in their little tiffs."
"Can't you fly higher?" Atreyu asked.
"Beyond their reach, you mean? No, I can't fly that high. And as far as I can see, there's nothing but water below us, some enormous ocean. I don't see any place to hide in."
"Then," said Atreyu, "we'll just have to wait till they get here. Anyway, there's something I want to ask them."
"What?"
cried the dragon, so terrified that he jumped, in a manner of speaking, sky high. "If they are the 4 wind giants," Atreyu explained, "they must know all 4 corners of Fantastica. If anyone can tell us where the borders are, it's them."
"Good Lord," cried the dragon. "You think you can just stop and chat with wind giants?"
"What are their names?" Atreyu asked.
"The one from the north," said Falkor, "is called Lear. The one from the east is Baureo. The one from the south is Shirek. And the one from the west is Maestril. But tell me, Atreyu, what are you? Are you a little boy or a bar of iron? How come you're not afraid?"
"When I passed through the Sphinx's gate," Atreyu replied, "I lost all my fear. And besides, I'm wearing the emblem of the childlike Empress. Everyone in Fantastica respects it. Why shouldn't the giants?"
"Oh, they will," cried Falkor. "They will, but they're stupid, and nothing can make them stop fighting one another. You'll see."
Meanwhile, the storm clouds from all 4 directions had converged.
It seemed to Atreyu that he was at the center of a huge funnel, which was revolving faster and faster, mixing the sulphur yellow, the leaden grey, the blood red, and the deep black all together. He and his white dragon were spun around in a circle like a matchstick in a great whirlpool, and then he saw the wind giants. Actually, all he saw was faces, because their limbs kept changing in every possible way, from long to short, from clear-cut to misty. And they were so knotted together in a monstrous free-for-all that it was impossible to make out their real shapes, or even how many of them there were. The faces, too, were constantly changing. Now they were round and puffed, now stretched from top to bottom or from side to side. But at all times they could be told apart. They opened their mouths and bellowed and roared and howled and laughed at one another. They didn't even seem to notice the dragon and his rider, who were gnats in comparison to the wind giants. Atreyu raised himself as high as he could. With his right hand he reached for the golden amulet on his chest and shouted at the top of his lungs, "In the name of the childlike empress, be still and listen!" And the unbelievable happened. As though suddenly stricken dumb, they fell silent. Their mouths closed, and 8 gigantic Google eyes were directed at Orin. The tempest stopped, and the air was deathly still. "Answer me!" cried Atreyu. "Where are the borders of the Fantastica? Do you know Lur?" "Not in the north," said the black cloud face. "And you, Bastian?" "Not in the east," said the leaden grey cloud face. "You tell me, Shirek." "There is no border in the south," said the sulphur yellow cloud face. "Maestril, do you know?" "No border in the west," said the fiery red cloud face. And then they all spoke as with one mouth. "Who are you who bear the emblem of the childlike empress and don't know that Fantastica has no borders?" Atreyu made no reply. He was stunned. It had never occurred to him that Fantastica might have no borders whatsoever. Then his whole quest had been for nothing. He hardly noticed it when the wind giants resumed their war games. He had given up caring what would happen to him. He clung fast to the dragon's mane when they were hurled upward by a whirlwind. The lightning played around them. They were spun in a circle and almost drowned in a downpour of rain. They were sucked into a fiery wind that nearly burned them up, but a moment later a hailstorm, consisting not of stones but of icicles as long as spears, flung them downward. So it went, up and down and up, this way and that. The wind giants were fighting for power. A gust of wind turned Falkor over on his back. "Hold tight!" he shouted. But it was too late. Atreyu had lost his hold and fell. He fell, and then he lost consciousness. When he came to, Atreyu was lying on white sand. He heard the sounds of waves, and when he looked around he saw that he had been washed up on a beach. It was a grey, foggy day, but there was no wind. The sea was calm, and there was no sign that the wind giants had been fighting a battle only a short time before. The beach was flat, and there were no hills or rocks in sight. Only a few gnarled and crooked trees which, seen through the mist, looked like great clawed hands. Atreyu sat up. Seeing his red buffalo hair cloak a few steps away, he crawled over to it and threw it over his shoulders. To his surprise, it was almost dry, so he must have been lying here for quite a while. How had he got there? Why hadn't he drowned? Dimly, he remembered arms that had carried him, and strange singing voices. "Poor child, beautiful child, hold him, don't let him go under." Perhaps it had only been the sound of the waves. Or could it have been a sea nymph and some water sprites? Probably they had seen the glory, and that was why they had saved him. Involuntarily, he reached for the amulet. It was gone. There was no chain around his neck.
He had lost the gem. "Falkor!" he shouted as loud as he could. He jumped up and ran back and forth, shouting in all directions, "Falkor! Falkor! Where are you?" No answer came back. Only the slow, steady sound of the waves breaking against the beach. Heaven only knew where the wind giants had driven the white dragon. Maybe Falkor was looking for his little master in an entirely different place, miles and miles away. Maybe he wasn't even alive. No longer was Atreyu a dragon rider, and no longer was he the childlike empress's messenger. He was only a little boy, and all alone. The clock in the belfry struck 6. But then it was dark outside. The rain had stopped. Not a sound to be heard. Bastian stared into the candle flames. Then he gave a start. The floor had creaked. He thought he heard someone breathing. He held his breath and he listened. Except for the small circle of light shed by the candles, it was dark in the big attic. Didn't he hear soft steps on the stairs? Hadn't the handle of the attic door moved ever so slowly? Again, the floor creaked. What if there were ghosts in this attic? "Nonsense," said Bastian, none too loudly. "There's no such thing. Everyone knows that." Then why were there so many stories about them? Maybe all the people who say ghosts don't exist are just afraid to admit that they do. Atreyu wrapped himself up tight in his red cloak, for he was cold, and started inland. The country, as far as he could see through the fog, was flat and monotonous. The only change he noticed as he strode along was the appearance among the stunted trees of bushes which looked as if they were made of rusty sheet metal and were almost as hard. You could easily hurt yourself brushing against them if you weren't careful. About an hour later, Atreyu came to a road paved with bumpy, irregular-shaped stones. Thinking it was bound to lead somewhere, he decided to follow it, but preferred to walk on the soft ground besides the bumpy paving stones. The road kept twisting and turning, though it was hard to see why, for there was no sign of any hill, pond, or stream. In that part of the country, everything seemed to be crooked. Atreyu hadn't been skirting the road for very long when he heard a strange thumping sound. It was far away, but coming closer. It sounded like the muffled beat of a big drum. In between beats, he heard a tinkling of bells and a shrill piping that could have been made of fifes. He hid behind a bush by the side of the road and waited to see what would happen. Slowly, the strange music came closer, and then the first shapes emerged from the fog. They seemed to be dancing, but it was a dance without charm of gaiety. The dancers jumped grotesquely, rolled on the ground, crawled on all four, leapt into the air, and carried on like crazy people. But all Atreyu could hear was the slow, muffled drum beats, the shrill fifes, and a whimpering and panting from many throats. More and more figures appeared. The procession seemed endless. Atreyu looked at the dancers' faces. They were ashen grey and bathed in sweat, and the eyes had a wild, feverish glow. Some of the dancers lashed themselves with whips. "They're mad," Atreyu thought, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. The procession consisted mostly of night-hobs and kobolds and ghosts. There were vampires as well, and quite a few witches, old ones with great humps and beards, but also young ones who looked beautiful and wicked. If he had had Orin, he would have approached them and asked what was going on. As it was, he preferred to stay in his hiding place until the mad procession had passed and the last straggler vanished, hoping and limping into the fog. Only then did he venture out on the road and look after the ghostly procession. Should he follow them? He couldn't make up his mind. By that time, to tell the truth, he didn't know if there was anything that he should or should not do. For the first time,
He was fully aware of how much he needed the childlike Empress's amulet, and how helpless he was without it. And not only, or even mainly, because of the protection it had given him, it was thanks to his own strength, after all, that he had stood up to all the hardships and terrors and the loneliness of his quest. But as long as he had carried the emblem, he had never been at a loss for what to do. Like a mysterious compass, it had guided his thoughts in the right direction, and now that was changed. Now he had no secret power to lead him. He had no idea what to do, but he couldn't bear to stand there as though paralyzed. So he made himself follow the muffled drumming, which could still be heard in the distance. While making his way through the fog, always careful to keep a suitable distance between himself and the last stragglers, he tried to put his thoughts in order. Why, oh why, hadn't he listened when Falkor advised him to fly straight to the childlike Empress? He would have brought her Uyulala's message and returned the gem. Without Orin and without Falkor, he would never be able to reach her. She would wait for him till her last moment, hoping he would come, trusting him to save her in Fantastica, but in vain. That in itself was bad enough, but still worse was what he had learned from the Wind Giants, that Fantastica had no borders. If there was no way of leaving Fantastica, then it would be impossible to call in a human from across the border, because Fantastica was endless. Its end was inevitable. But while he was stumbling over the bumpy paving stones in the fog, Uyulala's voice resounded in his memory, and a spark of hope was kindled in his heart. Lots of humans had come to Fantastica in the past and given the childlike Empress glorious new names. That's what she had sung. So there was a way from the one world to the other. For them it is near, but for us too far. Never can we go out to them. Yes, those were Uyulala's words. Humans, the children of man, had forgotten the way, but mightn't just one of them, a single one, remember? His own hopeless situation mattered little to Atreyu. What mattered was that a human should hear Fantastica's cry of distress and come to the rescue, as had happened many times before. Perhaps one had already started out and was on his way. Yes, yes, Bastian shouted. Then, terrified of his own voice, he added more softly, I'd go and help if I knew how. I don't know the way, Atreyu. I don't. The muffled drum beats and the shrill piping had stopped. Without noticing it, Atreyu had come so close to the procession that he almost ran into the last stragglers. Since he was barefoot, his steps were soundless. But that wasn't why those creatures took no notice of him. He could have been stomping with hobnailed boots and shouting at the top of his lungs without attracting their attention. By that time, the procession had broken up, and the spooks were scattered over a large muddy field interspersed with grey grass. Some swayed from side to side, others stood or sat motionless, but in all their eyes there was a feverish glow, and they were all looking in the same direction. Then Atreyu saw what they were staring at in fascinated horror. On the far side of the field lay the nothing. It was the self-same nothing that he had seen from the bark troll's treetop, or on the plain where the magic gates of the southern oracle had stood, or looking down from Falkor's back. But up until then he had always seen it from a distance. This time it was close by. It cut across the entire landscape and was coming slowly but irresistibly closer. Atreyu saw that the spooks in the field ahead of him were twitching and quivering. Their limbs were convulsed and their mouths were wide open, as though they had wanted on screams or laugh, though not a sound came out of them. And then all at once, like leaves driven by a gust of wind, they rushed toward the nothing. They leapt, they rolled, they flung themselves into it.
The last of the ghostly crowd had just vanished when Atreyu felt, to his horror, that his own body was beginning to take short, convulsive steps in the direction of the nothing. He felt drawn to it by an unreasoning desire and braced his will against it. He commanded himself to stand still. Slowly, very slowly, he managed to turn around and step by step, as though bucking a powerful current, to struggle forward. The force of attraction weakened, and he ran with all his might over the bumpy paving stones. He slipped, fell, picked himself up, and ran on. He had no time to wonder where this foggy road would lead. He followed the senseless twists and turns of the road until high, pitch-black ramparts appeared in the fog ahead of him. Behind them, several crooked towers jutted into the grey sky. The heavy wooden wings of the town gate were rotting away and hung loose on rusty hinges. Atreyu went in. It was growing colder and colder in the attic. Bastian's teeth were chattering. What if he should get sick? What would become of him then? He might come down with pneumonia, like Willie, a boy in his class. Then he would die all alone in this attic. There'd be no one to help him. He'd have been very glad just then to have his father come and save him. But go home? No, he couldn't. He'd rather die. He took the rest of the army blankets and wrapped them around him. After a while, he felt warmer. That was the end of chapter 8.